The world stands at a precarious crossroads as January 2026 unfolds, with geopolitical tensions reaching levels not seen since the height of the Cold War. In the ornate halls of Vilnius, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a declaration that would reverberate through diplomatic channels across the globe. The security guarantee agreement with the United States had reached its final form, awaiting only the ceremonial signatures that would bind two nations in a 15-year commitment. The document represented more than mere words on paper. It symbolized a fundamental shift in the architecture of international security, one that would require ratification by both the American Congress and the Ukrainian Parliament. The weight of this agreement cannot be understated. For Ukraine, a nation that has endured years of conflict and uncertainty, these guarantees represent a lifeline to stability and protection. The provision for extension beyond the initial 15 years suggests a long-term strategic partnership that goes far beyond temporary military aid. This commitment arrives at a moment when the very foundations of European security are being tested and redefined. The mechanisms within this agreement, though not publicly detailed in their entirety, signal a departure from previous frameworks of international support. Meanwhile, in the gilded conference rooms of Abu Dhabi, trilateral negotiations unfolded between Ukrainian, Russian, and American delegations. The atmosphere in these closed-door sessions remained tense, with fundamental disagreements persisting over the most critical issue at stake: territorial concessions. American mediators attempted to bridge the chasm between positions that appeared irreconcilable. The Ukrainian position remained firm on territorial integrity, while Russian demands continued to reflect their military gains on the ground. These negotiations represented a delicate dance, one where every word carried the weight of thousands of lives and the future of entire regions. The American role as mediator placed Washington in an extraordinarily complex position. Balancing support for Ukrainian sovereignty while attempting to forge a pathway toward some form of resolution required diplomatic skills of the highest order. The fact that these talks occurred in Abu Dhabi, rather than a European capital, suggested the involvement of Gulf states as potential guarantors or observers, adding another layer to an already intricate diplomatic puzzle. The outcomes of these discussions would shape not only the immediate future of the conflict, but potentially the entire post-war order in Eastern Europe. Ukraine's strategic vision extended beyond military guarantees. The push for European Union membership by 2027 represented an economic dimension to security that complemented the American military commitments. Full EU integration would provide economic stability, access to markets, and the institutional frameworks that could help rebuild a war-torn nation. This dual approach of seeking both American military backing and European economic integration demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of modern security architecture. Economic prosperity and political stability had become as crucial to national defense as tanks and artillery. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden connections and real-world events shaping our current geopolitical landscape, subscribe to Mysteries and Conspiracy Theories, where we break down the stories that mainstream media often overlooks. Far to the east, in the strategic waters of the Black Sea, another crisis was brewing within the Russian military establishment. The command structure of the Black Sea Fleet faced an unprecedented internal reckoning. Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, the fleet commander, found himself under intense scrutiny following a series of catastrophic failures in defending against Ukrainian naval drone attacks. Over the preceding 6 months, at least 8 successful Ukrainian drone strikes had penetrated Russian naval defenses, exposing vulnerabilities that should never have existed in a modern military force. The pattern of these attacks revealed systematic failures in readiness and response protocols. Internal investigations uncovered disturbing details about reaction times, with Russian forces taking between 20 and 40 minutes to respond to drone incursions. In modern naval warfare, such delays proved catastrophic. 40 minutes provided more than enough time for small, nimble, unmanned surface vessels to reach their targets and execute their missions. The technological asymmetry favored the attackers, as relatively inexpensive drones inflicted damage on vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Vice Admiral Akhmerov emerged as the likely replacement for Pinchuk, representing not just a change in personnel, but potentially a complete overhaul of Black Sea Fleet doctrine and defensive strategies. The pressure for this change came from the highest levels of Russian military command, where the repeated failures had become impossible to ignore. These incidents represented more than tactical setbacks. They signaled a fundamental shift in naval warfare where traditional power projection faced challenges from asymmetric threats that existing defensive systems struggled to counter. The Black Sea had transformed from a secure strategic rear into a contested battle space where Ukraine, despite lacking a traditional navy, managed to impose significant costs on Russian naval operations. This reversal carried implications far beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Naval planners worldwide took note of how relatively simple technologies, when employed with innovation and tactical acumen, could neutralize conventional naval superiority. The lessons being written in the waters off Crimea would influence naval doctrine and procurement decisions for decades to come. These interconnected developments painted a picture of a world in flux, where old certainties crumbled and new paradigms emerged. The security guarantee agreement between Ukraine and the United States, the fraught negotiations in Abu Dhabi, and the crisis within the Russian Black Sea Fleet Command all represented facets of a larger transformation. The international order that had existed since the end of the Cold War was being rewritten, not through grand conferences or formal treaties alone, but through the daily realities of conflict, negotiation, and strategic adaptation. As January 2026 progressed, these events continued to unfold with consequences that would ripple through the coming months and years. The decisions made in Vilnius, Abu Dhabi, and Moscow would shape the contours of European security for a generation. The world watched, waited, and wondered what the final chapter of this unfolding drama would reveal. While the maritime crisis in the Black Sea exposed vulnerabilities in Russian naval command, an even more explosive situation was unfolding thousands of miles to the east. In Beijing, the upper echelons of the Chinese military establishment faced their most severe internal crisis in decades. General Zhang Yuxia, 75 years old and holding the position of the highest-ranking military officer in China, found himself at the center of accusations that threatened to shake the foundations of the People's Liberation Army. Zhang's position had seemed unassailable. As a close ally of President Xi Jinping, he had navigated the complex politics of the Communist Party with apparent skill for years. His proximity to power made the allegations against him all the more stunning. The charges were not minor administrative infractions or political disagreements. Instead, Zhang stood accused of leaking sensitive technical information about Chinese nuclear weapons to the United States. The gravity of such an accusation in the context of modern great power competition cannot be overstated. The allegations extended beyond espionage. Zhang also faced charges of accepting bribes in exchange for military promotions, a practice that undermined the meritocratic principles the party claimed to uphold. Perhaps most damaging politically, he was accused of forming factions within the military that damaged the unity of the Communist Party. In a system where Dang de Zhuedui Lingdao means absolute party control over the military, such factional behavior represented a direct challenge to the established order. The evidence trail that led to Zhang's exposure emerged partially from investigations into Gu Jun, the former director of China's State Nuclear Corporation. This connection suggested that the rot extended beyond individual misconduct into systemic issues within China's most sensitive defense sectors. The nuclear weapons program represented the ultimate guarantor of Chinese sovereignty and great power status. Any compromise of its technical secrets carried strategic implications that resonated far beyond immediate security concerns. Military analysts and China watchers described the situation as the most significant reorganization of Chinese military leadership since the era of Mao Zedong. Such comparisons invoked memories of the tumultuous periods when political purges swept through military ranks, often with devastating consequences for institutional cohesion and operational effectiveness. The parallels to those earlier upheavals raised questions about whether this represented genuine counter-espionage efforts or served as cover for broader political maneuvering within the party elite. Across the Taiwan Strait, officials in Taipei monitored these developments with intense interest and growing concern. Any instability or reorganization within the People's Liberation Army carried direct implications for Taiwan's security calculus. The island's defense planners needed to understand whether these changes would strengthen or weaken Beijing's military capabilities, whether command structures would become more or less effective, and how the purge might affect operational planning for potential conflict scenarios. The timing of Zhang's downfall coincided with broader shifts in the global security environment. As the United States deepened its security commitments to Ukraine and maintained its presence throughout the Indo-Pacific, China faced strategic pressures on multiple fronts. The revelation that its top military officer might have compromised nuclear secrets to Washington added another dimension to the complex relationship between the world's two largest economies and military powers. While Beijing grappled with its internal military crisis, another transformation was occurring in the Middle East. Russian forces had begun withdrawing from the airport at Qamishli in northeastern Syria, a facility they had occupied since 2019. The withdrawal involved the systematic movement of military equipment and heavy weaponry to the coastal airbase at Maimim along the Mediterranean. This redeployment represented a significant recalibration of Russian military posture in the Syrian theater. The context for this withdrawal involved the emergence of a new Syrian government under Ahmed al-Shara. This administration sought to reassert Damascus's control over territories that had previously operated under Kurdish forces. The Syrian Democratic Forces had maintained de facto autonomy in the northeast throughout years of civil war, but the new government in Damascus appeared determined to re-establish central authority. The Russian withdrawal from Qamishli suggested Moscow's recognition of these new political realities. However, Russia's pullback from Qamishli did not signal a complete abandonment of its Syrian presence. The two main Russian bases at Maimim and Tartus were set to remain operational under agreements between Damascus and Moscow. These facilities provided Russia with its only significant military foothold in the Mediterranean region, offering naval access and air power projection capabilities that Moscow valued highly. The strategic importance of maintaining these bases ensured they would remain priorities even as Russia consolidated its forces. The Syrian developments reflected broader patterns of Russian military adaptation. Just as the Black Sea Fleet struggled with Ukrainian drone attacks, forcing command changes and tactical adjustments, Russian forces in Syria demonstrated flexibility in responding to changing political landscapes. The ability to redeploy assets while maintaining core strategic positions showed a military establishment capable of learning and adapting, even as it faced setbacks in other theaters. These parallel crises in China and Syria illustrated how interconnected the modern security environment had become. A scandal in Beijing's military headquarters carried implications for Washington's strategic planning. Russian troop movements in Syria occurred against the backdrop of ongoing conflict in Ukraine and tensions with NATO. Every action by major powers generated reactions and counter-reactions across multiple theaters and domains. The consolidation of Russian forces at their coastal bases in Syria also reflected resource constraints imposed by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Maintaining far-flung deployments required logistical capabilities and financial resources that were increasingly stretched. The decision to pull back from interior positions while holding the Mediterranean bases suggested a prioritization of assets that favored defensible positions with clear strategic value over more exposed deployments. As these events unfolded across Eurasia, from the offices of power in Beijing to the desert airfields of northeastern Syria, they formed part of a larger pattern. The international system was undergoing a fundamental reorganization, with established relationships and power structures being tested and transformed. The accusations against General Zhang, the Russian withdrawal from Qamishli, and the ongoing Ukrainian conflict all represented different manifestations of this broader transformation. The consequences of these shifts would continue to reverberate through the coming months, affecting everything from military doctrine to diplomatic negotiations to the daily lives of millions living in conflict zones or under the shadow of great power competition. The world of early 2026 bore little resemblance to the international order that had existed just a few years prior, and the changes showed no signs of slowing. The restructuring of military power across Eurasia occurred against a backdrop of escalating tensions within the Western alliance itself. In Berlin, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining fundamental alliance protocols to Washington. The issue centered on NATO military exercises conducted in Greenland, a territory that had become an unexpected flashpoint in transatlantic relations. The German minister's frustration was evident as he articulated what should have been self-evident. The Greenland mission had been agreed upon by all NATO allies in advance and represented standard alliance cooperation rather than any form of provocation. The controversy had erupted when threats of significant tariffs emerged from Washington, targeting 8 European countries that had participated in the Greenland exercises. The proposed tariffs ranged from 10 to 25%, representing potential economic damage that would reverberate through European economies already facing multiple challenges. The justification for these threatened measures remained unclear to European officials who viewed the exercises as routine alliance activities on Danish territory. Greenland's strategic importance had grown exponentially in recent years. Its geographic position between North America and Europe, its proximity to Arctic shipping routes, and its potential mineral wealth made it a focal point of great power competition. The island's status as part of the Kingdom of Denmark but with significant autonomy created complex jurisdictional questions that various powers sought to exploit or clarify depending on their interests. NATO exercises in the territory represented an assertion of alliance solidarity and defensive preparedness in the High North. The resolution of the tariff crisis came through direct engagement between NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and American leadership during the World Economic Forum in Davos. The alpine setting of these discussions, far from the bureaucratic machinery of Brussels or Washington, allowed for the kind of frank diplomatic exchange that formal channels sometimes hindered. The understanding reached in Davos led to the withdrawal of the tariff threats, but the episode left lingering questions about alliance cohesion and the reliability of established frameworks for consultation and decision-making. The Greenland incident highlighted broader strains within the Western alliance structure. While NATO faced external challenges from Russian military actions and Chinese strategic ambitions, internal coherence appeared increasingly fragile. The ease with which a routine military exercise could escalate into threats of economic warfare between allies suggested deeper fissures in transatlantic relations that extended beyond any single policy disagreement. These alliance tensions manifested not only in NATO military affairs, but also within European Union institutions. In Brussels, a bitter personal and political conflict was unfolding between two of the most powerful women in European politics. Kaja Kallas, the EU's chief diplomat and former Estonian Prime Minister, had been describing European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen as a dictator in private conversations. The characterization reflected deep frustrations with how power and authority were being exercised within EU structures. The conflict between Kallas and von der Leyen extended beyond personality clashes into substantive disputes over institutional competencies and spheres of authority. The Commission had systematically stripped Kallas of responsibilities, most notably removing her oversight of Mediterranean affairs. This bureaucratic maneuvering represented more than administrative reorganization. It constituted a deliberate effort to constrain the foreign policy apparatus that Kallas nominally led as High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The Commission's efforts to reduce the size and influence of the European External Action Service, the EU's diplomatic corps, further demonstrated the institutional power struggle. When Kallas attempted to place an ally in a strategic position within the foreign policy machinery, von der Leyen's office blocked the appointment. Such interventions revealed the extent to which the Commission presidency sought to centralize control over EU external relations, potentially at the expense of the designated foreign policy chief. This internal European conflict carried significant implications beyond Brussels Palace intrigue. At a moment when Europe faced unprecedented security challenges from the war in Ukraine to energy security to managing relations with an increasingly assertive China, institutional dysfunction at the highest levels of EU leadership undermined the Union's capacity for effective action. The inability of top officials to work cooperatively signaled to both allies and adversaries that European unity remained more aspirational than actual. While political leaders feuded in Brussels and Davos, critical energy infrastructure incidents reminded the world of the fragility underlying modern industrial civilization. In Kazakhstan, the Tengiz oil field, the country's largest and operated by a Chevron-led consortium, had resumed production after devastating fires on January 18th. The blazes had struck transformers in the turbine facility that powered the entire operation, forcing the evacuation of 473 workers and halting production of more than 600,000 barrels per day. The Tengiz fires represented more than a localized industrial accident. The field's massive production capacity made it a critical node in global energy markets. Any extended shutdown would have rippled through oil prices and supply chains worldwide. Kazakhstan established a special commission to investigate the incident, recognizing that the causes needed to be understood and addressed to prevent recurrence. The speed with which production resumed suggested both the facility's importance and the effectiveness of emergency response protocols. Further west, the Russian port of Novorossiysk had returned to normal operations at the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal after completing repairs from Ukrainian drone attacks that had occurred in November of the previous year. Those strikes had significantly damaged one of 3 loading berths, reducing export capacity to its lowest level in 14 months. The impact extended beyond Russian interests, as the pipeline system transported approximately 80% of Kazakhstan's oil exports. The Kazakh government had formally protested the Ukrainian attacks on infrastructure that carried its crude to international markets. This diplomatic complaint illustrated the complex web of interests surrounding energy infrastructure in conflict zones. Kazakhstan, while maintaining generally good relations with both Russia and Western nations, found its economic interests threatened by a conflict in which it was not directly involved. The restoration of full capacity at Novorossiysk provided relief to Kazakh exporters and helped stabilize regional energy flows. These infrastructure incidents, whether accidental fires in Kazakhstan or deliberate attacks on Russian export facilities, underscored the vulnerability of the systems that powered the global economy. The concentration of production capacity in specific facilities created potential choke points where disruptions could cascade through international markets. As geopolitical tensions intensified and conflicts expanded to target economic infrastructure, the resilience of energy systems faced growing tests. The convergence of alliance strains, institutional conflicts, and infrastructure vulnerabilities painted a picture of a world system under mounting pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The vulnerabilities in energy infrastructure and the fractures within Western institutions formed part of a larger pattern of uncertainty that permeated every level of international interaction. Even the most mundane aspects of daily life had become entangled in the web of suspicion and heightened security awareness that characterized the new global reality. An incident near San Diego illustrated how thoroughly geopolitical tensions had seeped into everyday existence and routine encounters. Two Russian citizens found themselves detained after inadvertently entering Camp Pendleton, the sprawling Marine Corps base near San Diego. Their navigation system had directed them along what appeared to be a shorter route, leading them through security checkpoints and into a parking area designated for military vehicles. The women remained in custody, facing potential sentences of up to 6 months in prison for what appeared to be a navigational error rather than any deliberate infiltration attempt. Local residents familiar with the area reported that such incidents occurred with surprising frequency. The configuration of roads and the placement of base entrances created situations where civilian GPS systems could direct unsuspecting travelers directly onto military property. Under normal circumstances, such mistakes might result in nothing more than redirections and stern warnings. However, the current international climate transformed routine errors into potential security incidents requiring detention and investigation. The fact that the detained individuals held Russian citizenship elevated what might otherwise have been a minor local news story into something more significant. Every interaction involving Russian nationals in the United States now carried additional weight and scrutiny. The presumption of innocent mistakes had given way to careful verification and extended detention while authorities determined intent and background. This represented a microcosm of how great power competition had infiltrated even the most ordinary aspects of civilian life. The Camp Pendleton incident connected to broader themes that had emerged throughout the preceding months. Just as the Chinese military grappled with allegations of espionage at its highest levels, just as Russian naval commanders faced consequences for defensive failures, and just as European allies found themselves threatening each other with economic measures, two women following GPS directions became entangled in the machinery of national security. The threads of suspicion and precaution that characterized relations between major powers extended downward to affect individual lives in unexpected ways. The convergence of all these developments painted a comprehensive picture of a world in transition. The security guarantees being negotiated between Ukraine and the United States represented attempts to establish new frameworks of stability. The trilateral negotiations in Abu Dhabi sought pathways toward resolution of active conflicts. Yet simultaneously, military commanders faced internal crises, alliance partners quarreled over routine exercises, institutional leaders engaged in destructive turf battles, and energy infrastructure remained vulnerable to both accidents and attacks. Each of these situations fed into and reinforced the others. The allegations against General Zhang Yuxia in China increased strategic uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific, which in turn affected calculations in Washington about resource allocation between European and Asian theaters. Russian withdrawals from Syrian positions reflected constraints imposed by ongoing operations in Ukraine, which themselves depended partly on the success or failure of Ukrainian drone campaigns against Black Sea Fleet assets. European unity, essential for effective sanctions and support policies, suffered from both the Greenland tariff dispute and the Callas von der Leyen conflict. The energy sector incidents demonstrated how quickly localized disruptions could threaten broader stability. The Tengiz fires in Kazakhstan, though ultimately contained and resolved, showed the concentration of production in facilities whose failure could impact global markets. The Ukrainian attacks on Novorossiysk, while militarily rational from Kiev's perspective, created diplomatic complications with Kazakhstan and demonstrated the difficulty of containing conflict effects to intended targets. Every action generated consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical or strategic objectives. These interconnected crises revealed fundamental questions about the nature of power and security in the modern world. Traditional measures of military strength, such as the number of ships in the Black Sea Fleet or the size of Chinese nuclear arsenals, mattered less when drone swarms could bypass conventional defenses or when internal corruption undermined command structures. Alliance frameworks that had provided stability for decades faced challenges from both external pressures and internal contradictions. Energy systems that powered modern civilization remained vulnerable to disruption from multiple sources. The world of January 2026 existed in a state of profound uncertainty. The old order had clearly fractured, with institutions and relationships that once seemed permanent now appearing contingent and fragile. Yet the shape of whatever new order might emerge remained unclear. Would the security guarantees between Ukraine and the United States establish a template for future arrangements, or would they prove insufficient to the challenges ahead? Would the internal crises in the Chinese and Russian militaries lead to fundamental reforms or merely cosmetic changes? Would European institutions find ways to resolve their internal conflicts and present united fronts, or would fragmentation continue? The resolution of these questions would determine not only the immediate fate of those directly involved, but the broader contours of international relations for years to come. The people living through these events, from Ukrainian civilians hoping for lasting security, to Chinese military officers navigating political purges, to European diplomats trying to coordinate policy amid institutional warfare, all faced futures shaped by decisions being made in capitals around the world. As infrastructure burned in Kazakhstan and diplomatic tensions flared over Greenland, as military commanders lost their positions and institutional leaders battled for bureaucratic supremacy, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Humanity had constructed a global system of remarkable complexity and interdependence, one that had delivered unprecedented prosperity to billions, but that now showed signs of strain from multiple directions simultaneously. The choices made in response to these strains would echo through the decades ahead. For those seeking to understand the deeper patterns behind these surface events and the hidden connections that link seemingly disparate incidents across continents, mysteries and conspiracy theories offers detailed analysis and investigation into the stories that shape our world in ways both obvious and obscure. The events of these opening weeks of 2026 raised questions that demanded answers from everyone who would be affected by their outcomes. As military alliances shifted, as energy flows faced disruption, as institutional conflicts paralyzed decision-making, observers around the world found themselves asking fundamental questions about the nature of the emerging order. In the great reshuffling of global power and the redrawing of strategic maps, who ultimately stood on the side of stability and who accelerated the march toward greater chaos? When traditional allies threatened each other with economic warfare, and when navigation errors led to detention and potential imprisonment, had the world crossed some threshold from which return to previous norms had become impossible? Perhaps most critically, as these multiple crises unfolded simultaneously across different theaters and domains, what perspective made sense of the whole? Who bore responsibility for the escalating tensions, and who worked genuinely toward resolution? In this complex tapestry of accusations, conflicts, and transformations, where did truth reside and whose narrative deserved credence?